Professor McCarty, thank you so much for joining us.
Great, thank you.
Why don't we start with your background, where you started, sort of the arc of your career, what you're doing now?
Sure. So by training, I'm what you might call a political economist. I essentially did a joint PhD at Carnegie Mellon University, so combining political science and economics. So, much of my academic career has focused on the intersection of politics and economics. I started my career, my first job at the University of Southern California in a business school. Later moved to Columbia University in a political science department, and now I'm here at Princeton, jointly appointed in the public policy school along with the political science department. So the bulk of my career has sort of been looking at both politics and economics in a relatively unified way, trying to make sense of both the kind of economic factors which drive political behavior, but also how politics affects economic policy making and the economic outcomes we see in society.
So broadly speaking, you're one of the classical political economy types versus a specialist in one or the other.
I'm not so classic. I actually writing my lecture this morning describing classical political economy, from Marx and McCarty. I'm not one of those guys. I use the tools of economics and econometrics and statistics to build models and test models of political behavior. So I'm not classical in that sense, but I've been driven by sort of the classical questions of, who gets what, when, how political institutions affect society at large, and the kind of external social factors on our political outcomes.
And so I know you've done some work on Congress and thought about that specifically, and we'll get into that, but just broadly speaking, where are your research interests?
So probably the most sustained research interest of mine is on political polarization in the United States, both looking at, as we'll talk about, within Congress, but more extensively on the polarization of voters and citizens, how it's impacted our institutions, including Congress, the courts, the presidency, with an ultimate goal of sort of thinking about how it affects, the decisions that society makes about how to allocate its resources.
So polarization is the main thrust of your research.
It's the main thrust. I've done some other things related to business and politics, regulation, things on how bureaucracies make decisions. But I think all of this sort of tie into issues of polarization and political conflict and how they manifest themselves in various institutions.
Well, why don't we start with polarization then in Congress itself? So you've done a lot of work in this area. So what kind of questions are you asking about polarization and as it relates to Congress, and have you found any interesting answers along the way?
Sure. So I like to point out to people that I started working on polarization about 30 years ago. It was almost a kind of a measurement exercise with my dissertation advisors. We had developed some statistical tools to measure the extent of polarization in Congress by looking at roll call voting. My advisors, they noticed something was happening in the mid to early 1980s, but it was really fairly small at that point. But we started working on it together in the mid 1990s. It was pretty clear that something important was going on, that the cooperation between Democratic and Republican legislators on legislation had started to decline, and it started in the late 1970s. So one of the things you often worry about when you start a research agenda around a new trend is that you've noticed a new trend and it's going to go away soon. So fortunately for me, but probably unfortunately for everyone else, that wasn't the case here. The patterns that we started to discover in the mid 1990s, the trends, they've continued to this day. So a lot of the kind of basic research that we did was really almost just descriptive, just kind of describing the patterns and what seemed to be associated with polarization and what wasn't associated with polarization. So For example, we found that the polarization that we measured in the US House essentially had the same trend and trajectory as that of the Senate. We also found that there weren't any real breakpoints. As I pointed out, the trend started increasing in the late 1970s, but no big events really drove the trajectory. So it was increasing before Reagan became president and increasing after. The Feldborg nomination is often given as a polarizing event. We find that it's just right on the trend. The election of George Bush and the contested election, none of those things really seem to matter. It really seemed to be this kind of long-term pattern toward more and more conflict within Congress, which wasn't contained either in the House or the Senate. And then we started, me and other co-authors started looking at the states, and we found the same patterns in the states, more and more conflict across parties, and dysfunction in those state legislatures. So part of the question then became why these trends, why did they change at the same time, the time they did? The focus of one of my books, the earliest book on polarization, really is on how economic conflicts and social conflicts, in particular around immigration, led to a polarizing effect in Congress, in the extent that it kind of drove income inequality, immigration, and the response to immigration drove policy wedges between the parties that the parties themselves were able to exploit. Republican Party moving to the right and the Democratic Party moving somewhat to the left. And then more recently we've kind of extended those analyses to the states, so forth. So a lot of it's really been focused on the kind of deeper social reasons that we have such polarized legislatures. But more recently, I've begun to focus on the implications of polarization for governance, which I think ultimately is the bigger question. So I've done some studies looking at how polarization impacts the ability of Congress to legislate, whether they can solve big major problems, such as the ones we face with inequality, climate change, immigration, basically finding that polarization does in fact impede its ability to do that. I've also looked at the role of polarization in the appropriations process. Many people know Congress's ability to basically govern on fiscal matters has deteriorated pretty dramatically over time. They don't pass appropriation bills on time anymore. They pass them excessively late in many cases. In years in which they don't lead to a government shutdown, it still leads to situations where government bureaucracies have to spend a lot of time planning for what if there is a shutdown. So sometimes those costs are as great as the shutdowns themselves. So the more recent focus is really on the implications of polarization for governance, but also to think about, in light of the fact that polarization seems to be coming from society at large, it's not something that's intrinsic to Congress, to think more about how Congress can govern in a polarized system rather than assuming that there's some light switch that we can turn off to make polarization go away.
And so when you talk about the causes of polarization, I mean, you've mentioned, and I know you've made this comment in the past, that the officials or those who are elected are typically more polarized than the electorate itself, and that this has continued to compound over time. And so when we look at Congress itself, one of the key consequences of that would be that the individual members of Congress are not necessarily as representative of the population as they would have been in the past. Is that accurate?
I think that's accurate. There's a little bit of a debate among political scientists to the extent to which members of Congress are sort of out of step with their constituencies. I think if, by any reasonable measure, however, I think members of Congress are probably out of step with their typical constituent, but they're probably not that out of step with their more activist partisan constituencies. And so when we think about the connection between legislators and their constituencies, we have to kind of look at both of those angles, which is that, the typical American is still quite moderate in their political views, but the bases of the two parties, the people most engaged in politics, most engaged, not just simply in voting in primaries, but also in contributing money, making contact with members, the people that members are probably going to get have the most contact with, the most information from, are much more extreme than the typical American. And it does lead to a situation where, at least the views that members of Congress act upon are much more extreme, than the typical views of American citizens.
And so how does that polarization play out in the Congress itself? I mean, it would seem relatively obvious, but maybe we should walk through some of those consequences. Is it they just don't vote on each other's bills? Does it mean they don't talk to each other in committee? Does it mean that, they are the minority is more marginalized than it used to be in terms of its voice? What actually is the consequence of this polarization in the Congress functioning?
I think to some extent all of those things are true, but the thing I would just focus on, the kind of most simple, direct effect, is that it makes it difficult to create large coalitions of members to do anything. Now, if this were the British Parliament, we probably wouldn't even care about polarization, because the coalition you need to pass major legislation is 50% plus one, which is guaranteed essentially for the government, because they're the government, because they have 50% plus one members. We don't have that political system. We have checks and balances and separation of powers. We have special rules in the House, plus the cloture rule in the Senate. So it means that for legislation to be successful, it has to have a fairly substantial number of legislators to back it. In a world in which both the parties are about equal sized, and then they're polarized on ideological and partisan grounds, it makes it very, very hard to get the size coalitions that you need, to pass important legislation. My colleague Frances Lee has documented in some of her work, it's still true when you get important legislation in the U.S., it tends to be bipartisan, with the exception of, some bills during President Obama's first term. And there are lots of reasons for that, again, to get over cloture, to get enough support among Republicans that moderate Democrats feel okay to support something, or enough support from Democrats that moderate Republicans are okay to support something. It takes a reasonably substantial coalition. And equally divided parties who are polarized, you just don't get that. So things don't happen. So that's really the first issue. The second issue is that when the parties are polarized and elections are very competitive, the parties have incentives to strategically disagree with one another, to basically to take whatever differences they have, baseline differences they have, and inflate them for partisan purposes. To basically say, this Democratic bill is a jobs killer. No matter what the bill is, the Republicans will say things like that. And then, anything the Republicans propose, the Democrats are going to say this hurts the poor, whether it does or not, just simply because they can kind of score political points. So even if they could agree on the merits of an issue, the political value of those disagreements becomes very valuable under polarization. And the third thing, and I think this really, as you mentioned, I'm happy to come back to, is that I think one of the implications of polarized environment is that a lot of decision making has been centralized away from rank and file members in their committees, roles on committees, up to leadership. And so one of the implications now is that there are a lot of members of Congress who don't have anything to do or have no influence whatsoever on the process. And so, what are they going to do? They're going to go on TV and Twitter, Instagram, and try to raise money. In a polarized environment, the way to raise money is to make fairly extreme statements about the views of their own party and the views of the other party. And so it's this kind of like almost, if you will, excess labor of legislators with nothing to do except for kind of stoke the fires of partisanship and polarization, which makes it even harder to build broad public consensus that you need in order to to do major things, or even to get appropriation bills passed on time.
I'm curious your opinion on the role of the Speaker of the House. And the Senate's a little bit of a different animal, but on the Speaker side, or I should just say on the leadership side, generally speaking, how much does their polarization matter compared to the general rank and file? Are they typically more extreme, less extreme? Are they, if all the decisions are being concentrated in those individuals, it would seem that they would take their whatever level of polarization they have would take an outsized effect on the output. So what is your opinion on, or what does the data say about the leadership polarization status?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think the leaders are out of step with their parties. I mean, they have to get elected by their parties by a majority vote in their parties. And, both because, the leaders have to take a very active role and to get things done, and because some of the members don't want to do very much, but other than fundraise, they endow their leaders to do a lot. So I don't think the leaders themselves are exceptionally polarized relative to their parties. I think Speaker Pelosi is probably right at the median of her party on most things, and Speaker McCarthy is probably right at the middle of his conference. I think there are real issues that the party leaders face, and it's not that they're the polarizing force. It's really in the American political system, our leaders don't have very many tools to kind of rein in the kind of extremists in their party. And so rather than pulling their parties out, I think they get pulled out by their party. So this was very evident when John Boehner was the speaker as leader of the Republicans. His major shortcoming as speaker wasn't that he was too extreme, it's that he had no tools with which to kind of discipline the far right wing of his party, the Freedom Caucus and others who wanted to impede any kind of legislative actions which might be perceived as benefiting the Democratic Party. So Speaker Boehner couldn't cut deals with the president because he couldn't deliver the Freedom Caucus. Numerically, Speaker Pelosi, I think, has less of a problem with her left flank because there are not as many of them as there are in the Freedom Caucus, but you can see some of the same dynamics, especially now as she's trying to get the Democratic budget bill passed and is being impeded because things are so close between the parties. It's being impeded by the possibility that 8 or 9 of her most progressive members are going to say no. So they're really, they're not pulling their parties apart. I think the parties are really kind of pushing them to more extremes than they would want to. I think the leaders actually want to be electorally viable in a broad sense, and so they don't want to take extreme positions. But members who represent fairly safe and extreme districts are always going to try to pull their parties out. I have one other kind of thought about, you mentioned speakers explicitly. In terms of thinking about reforms of Congress, one of the interesting things about the U.S. Congress that I think is underappreciated in comparative terms is that The speaker is a partisan officer who's elected by the majority party to serve as the chief executive officer of the entire House. Speaker of the British Commons is basically a bureaucrat who's selected to be the chief operating officer of the House of Commons, and to structure things in a much more kind of bureaucratically neutral way. If we're thinking this will never happen, but if we're thinking of pie in the sky reforms, which might improve Congress, it might be to actually take much of the job of the speaker and put it in more bureaucratic and less partisan hands in order to ensure, some equity between the majority and minority party in terms of their abilities to participate in policymaking, and that in itself might have a good impact on polarization.
Yeah, that's been brought up in one of my previous discussions, I think, with Mickey Edwards in particular brought this topic up, that the speaker doesn't even need to be a member, which is quite interesting. Would be
although, I mean, it could be a dual-edged sword, because there were rumors a few months ago that Donald Trump wanted to be appointed the speaker. They might need a constitutional change to take them out of the line of succession to the presidency, but I think having a much more organizationally neutral administration for these bodies would be one way of tackling the kind of excessive polarization.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting idea, and it brings up another question related to party and polarization that I've explored in the past, which is this idea of rules imposed on party members while in Congress. So I'm curious about your thought on this kind of like party-based rule system in Congress and how it impacts this polarizing trend.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm less convinced that imposing some party discipline. I mean, party discipline, I think, does probably in that have kind of a polarizing effect. But if it, but I think the real problem actually is sort of the lack of party discipline in particular areas, and its effects, both because it affects the kind of the perceptions of the public about the parties, and then feeds back into Congress through elections and fundraising. And that's the inability to kind of parties to impose discipline on kind of extreme behavior. So going back to the British, House of Commons example, leaders there have lots of tools at their disposal. They can literally write people out of the party. They can strip them of their party membership, not just their committee assignments like we do, but their party membership. They play an outsized role in denying them kind of renomination. And so it's a very strong set of tools, that can be used. There's still variation. I mean, there's discipline within the parties, but I don't think of Britain as being as polarized in general, in large part because of very extreme, elements of politics just don't happen there unless they're supported by a bulk of the party. In the US, we've seen a couple of examples where members were sanctioned by their parties for, Steve King and Marjorie Taylor Greene were sanctioned by the party by removing them from, committee assignments. My personal view is members with their legislative style don't care one bit about whether or not they're serving on committees, because that's not the source of their power and influence. Cable news, social media, other things are the source of their influence. But it's not really that much of a sanction at all. There's no sense in which Kevin McCarthy had finally had it with Marjorie Taylor Greene, that he could have any role in denying her renomination or stripping her of her party label. And that has big feedbacks into the incentives of members. They see that fairly egregious behavior not only goes unpunished by party leaders, but is rewarded by certain donors and so forth. And so it has this unraveling effect of kind of pushing the extremes of the parties to more extreme, and then eventually dragging the parties with them. Uh, so yeah, I think there's kind of, party discipline, I think, works in both of those ways. I'm of the mind that a little bit more party discipline on the margins would be depolarizing than more polarizing.
Well, let's move a little bit into another topic, and we'll come back to the incentives question in a bit. But I know you've written a book on game theory as it relates to politics. Maybe you can take us through that. What tools have you brought from economics or some of these other professions into politics, and what does it mean for Congress? How does that play out in Congress itself using tools like game theory?
Yeah. So game theory has been kind of a part of the toolkit for political scientists and economists who study Congress and the legislatures for some time. So the book you mentioned is really a PhD level textbook, which kind of summarizes a lot of models and so forth that have been quite useful in understanding Congress. In the earliest days, there was something called voting theory, which was try to work out the kind of features of different voting systems, whether it's plurality voting electoral systems or proportional electoral systems, ranked choice voting, so forth, to sort of understand elections, but also understand how voting in Congress works, how restrictions on amendments might make legislation better or worse, et cetera. So there's a whole literature on that. So part of what the book does is to kind of summarize those findings and teach students how to develop models there. I think one really relevant model that's it's mentioned in the book, but it's a published paper of mine, which I think has important implications for Congress, is a paper that I wrote with a guy named Tim Grosclose on bargaining before an audience. One of the central things about Congress and a lot of legislative bodies is that the negotiations take place in public, and voters get to make assessments about the behavior of their members, based on the actions they take while negotiating with the other side. It was completely unlike the corporate world, where corporate people hold themselves up in in conference rooms and hammer out an agreement in secret. Say a merger, they hammer out the merger in secret, then they take it to their boards for approval and shareholder votes, etc. So the shareholders and the boards, they get to see the final agreement, but they don't know which side made which concession at what time, and so they can only make assessments about the overall agreement. Congress, to a certain extent, especially in relation to its negotiating with the president, a lot of those negotiations are quite public. So presidents negotiating with Congress, there's a big public element, a lot of news coverage. Committee markups are very public. You can say who made which amendment and who voted for which amendment. Voting on the floor is very public. So it's a very different feature. And the voters can observe, who made which compromises at what time. And voters can then, ultimately hold members accountable for making compromises that they don't agree with. And the members can't fall back on the compromise was necessary for the entire package, because the voters can see the entire thing. So you can model this process, using game theory and mathematics to try to understand what the implications of doing these negotiations privately are, where the outsiders can only see the final agreement, versus a process in which the outside observers can see every step of the way. The main implication is that agreement is much less likely to occur when deliberations are public, because I'm unwilling to make a compromise to the other side if I feel like my voters are going to hold me accountable for doing so. The other side is unwilling to accept my compromises if they feel like their side is going to hold them accountable for doing so. So I don't make my compromise, both because I don't want my voters to see it, and also because I know the other guy is not going to accept it. So neither of us makes compromises. And so policies that should be changed end up not being changed. And so the argument is that this kind of public deliberation over legislation is an important source, of gridlock, especially when the parties are polarized, and that at least some, with the implication that at least some opportunities for less public negotiation. Americans love transparency, except it could well be that in many cases, less transparency might lead to better, to better outcomes. So that's just one example of where sort of game theory can be used to kind of illuminate kind of a trade-off with respect to congressional politics, and suggest some ideas for reform.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's been discussed in one of my personal theories is that the power will move towards the private area away from the public. And so that, inevitably, as you open up committee hearings and you open up different parts of the process, it's going to migrate to places where it's closed, like the speaker office or somewhere else where real privacy can happen.
I think it's right. So that's not, so it's interesting. So that's not part of the model because we don't incorporate that option. But that's another. If one were to do that, that would obviously be another implication. If you can't make the agreement in public, then you have to find a venue in which it can be done in private. In many cases, those private venues are not as representative as the public ones. We'd like to have public deliberations where all members are, actively making, proposals and amendments, hashing things out. But members are not willing to sort of put themselves in situations where they can do that in kind of a sincere, heartfelt way. When they do that on the floor, they're basically sending signals to their voters. I want to slash this. I want to send this messaging piece of legislation because I want to put the other side on the record of being against mom and apple pie, and the other side is trying to do the same thing. So the serious negotiation moves to this private space in which both is less representative of views because there's fewer people involved. And then again leaves the bulk of the legislative body of doing not much more than, signaling to their voters about, hot button issues.
I'm curious, since you've got some of this economics perspective, this is more of a complicated question as it relates to Congress as compared to game theory when applied to economics or any kind of market transaction economics where you have price movements as a key signal, right? The product usually can remain fixed, whereas the price can move according to supply and demand. Now, the difference in Congress is you have bills, and the price mechanism doesn't really work in this context if you conceive of the bill as the product. Mm-hmm. Instead, the bill itself can change through amendment.
Right.
So you have a kind of a modifiable product with a fixed number of votes that's required to get it over the line. How does that difference, or does it have any impact on this, on the structures or the processes involved in game theory or any other kind of, in your mind, how does that play out and make it different than traditional economics as applied to products?
Yeah, so this gets into an interesting debate, which I haven't totally formed on my opinions on. But, your one economic way of kind of thinking about, the legislative process is to think that bills and prices, in your analogy, aren't all that different. There could be enough side payments and transactions and stuff that, you can kind of get to the kind of, if you will, market clearing bill, yeah, that everyone's willing to sign off on if, you're able to, do enough side payments and transactions and have them, have the opportunity to save and trade favors. So you can imagine a model of legislative process. It starts to look a lot like the market if you can commit to, future trades and, have some store of value and all these sort of economic concepts you'd need to make it more like a market. The issue is that, even at the heyday of earmarks and kind of pork barrel politics, didn't quite ever have all those mechanisms in place. So it was always an issue that, you couldn't quite get to the kind of what, again, by analogy, this kind of market clearing bill. But now people argue that because of restricted earmarks and just restrict the amount in which kind of member specific pork barrel spending can go into bills, it's made things even worse, which has sort of exacerbated the gridlock associated with polarization because there's no longer any way to kind of build a coalition around side payments. I suspect there's a small effect of that. I don't. Some people will say, well, the earmark ban is the cause of everything that's bad. I don't believe that either. But yeah, this sort of the differences between, in your analogy, between a market and the legislative process obviously got more stark when they banned the side payments that earmarks were. So yeah, I think there's a lot to that analogy.
The other problem with looking at bills is that it's impossible to atomize them, right? Like with with stocks, right? You can have a bundle of stocks and you can break it down to the individual stock. Whereas with a bill, it's a collection of rules, right? And it's hard to break it down line by line to the rules and have those be traded. So you have these kind of bundles of rules that in some cases can't be unbundled.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, in some cases, the bundles are things that can and probably should be unbundled, but they need to go together for kind of strategic reasons that, again, there is this tendency to try to make it more like the market and that, we need to have these side payments. And so one of the ways we get these side payments, even without earmarks, is to kind of, bundle stuff together. And so people will attach legislation to various things in order to get it passed. But on the flip side, there's exactly the problem you identify, which is that there are these features which are kind of interrelated, and so you take one thing away, and then the whole edifice falls. And so this was the big debate around the Affordable Care Act, that it was, a three-legged stool with kind of, exchanges and subsidies and an individual mandate, and then become an issue of like, well, you can't really take any one of those three things away, or the other two aren't going to work. Turned out to be wrong. I guess it seems the evidence is now you can take the individual mandate away and the other things will do okay. But at the time, everyone thought that, it all had to stand or fall alone. And so that does make it hard to kind of horse trade in Congress when, there's these complementarities between, provisions that make the thing a complete edifice that can't be deconstructed in order to pick up a vote here or to pick up a vote there.
What about in terms of the types of decision that Congress makes? Like it would seem to me that there's these binary decisions, right, which are you pass the rule or you don't, right? And then there's other types of decisions which are more like magnitudes. It's $50 or $100 or $1 million or $1 billion, and anything in between. There's an infinite number of intermediate decisions that could be made. Whereas, to create the FBI or not to create the FBI is a binary decision, right?
Right.
And so Congress makes these decisions in the same way. They don't necessarily have to be, but I'm curious about whether that's ever been looked at, from when you're thinking about game theory or applying some of these economic paradigms to Congress, have you ever, looked at these different types of decisions and whether they could be or should be treated differently in Congress?
Yeah. I think, for the people who work in these models, it's a key decision whether to think about the policy as one that's kind of discrete and binary, or one that's kind of continuous, and therefore, as your question suggests, the continuous policies, like $1 billion, $1,000,001, $1,002,000. Those are easier to negotiate. You can take the slider and move it up and down the scale to get the right point. The binary ones again are tougher. You either have kind of a natural majority for it or a natural majority against it, and then there's not much you can do within the context of that particular policy, to kind of buy off those additional votes. That's where that's why things get bundled together. So create the Department of Homeland Security. That bill was not just, yes, no, we created a Department of Homeland Security, but there are a lot of other kind of stuff folded into it to kind of, make it slightly easier for some people to support. One of the bills I've looked at the most closely is, the Dodd-Frank bill, which, again, had a series of binary decisions in there, but they were all lumped together into a very big bill. And then there were, lots of things that had very little to do with, financial security, but were needed to kind of, placate different legislators. So yeah, those tensions are really apparent. And it gets back to the earmarks thing. If you have mostly binary bills, and then you restrict the ability to sweeten the deal, it makes it harder. It makes it harder to get those things done.
Right. Well, let's move on to the more general concept we talked about earlier, which is incentives. So you've got these bills, they can be expanded, collapsed on each other. It's a very complicated set of options that's all ever shifting. But meanwhile, these incentives that are acting on the players, they could be in line with the public interest. They could be at odds with the public interest. Can you talk through your perspective on incentives in Congress, how they play out? What are the major incentive systems that are there?
Yeah. So I think it's often important in discussion to start with a kind of classical distinction going back to Edmund Burke about delegates versus trustees. So a delegate is someone who a legislator tries to do exactly what the members of their constituency are telling them to do at any particular time. So they're basically pure agents of the constituency. And trustee is someone that, like in law, it's like, the constituencies, they kind of delegated them to the authority to act in the best interest of the constituency, whether the constituency actually understands what's in their best interest at any particular point in time. So my view is, I would like for a system where members acted more like trustees. I think there's a reason why we have representative government. And a big part of that is that, legislators are professionals at the process of learning about policy issues, understanding how policy works, and then weighing the preferences of their constituencies, and then making decisions in the best interest of their constituencies, without having to ask for permission from their constituencies to vote in a particular way. So for me, that's the ideal. I think there are lots of things that have impeded that ideal. In many cases, moved it closer to the delegate framework, and in many cases, divorced it completely from any framework of representation. The other things that kind of move it to the delegate framework is simply, this kind of explosion of, social media and cable, and the kind of coverage of the minutia of what members of Congress do. And so it's very, as we talked about before, the lack of transparency, the fact that, voters, constituents can both observe and weigh in on, any particular policy issue that comes before Congress, made it much more difficult for members to act in the kind of a broader conception of their constituents' best interest. They sometimes are kind of forced to do what the loudest voices from their districts are asking them to do. And so it kind of makes it harder for them to make these tough decisions that the trustees have to make. The other thing that's happened, again, polarization, partisanship, members much more beholden to parties, both within Congress and the kind of external partisan actors at kind of a national level. They get a lot of their support financially and otherwise from, not from their district, but from, national political networks organized around parties. So that moves them away from both the trusteeship and being good delegates of their constituents, because the constituencies aren't as important as the appealing to these national political networks, and so it really just distorts their incentives in those directions as well. And then the third thing I should say, polarization itself has a big distortion on incentives. Because it's very hard to hold members accountable for when they aren't good representatives. So, my member of Congress seems perfectly fine to me. I have no problems with her. But if for some reason we needed to replace her, the only option, because Princeton's a pretty democratic area district, would be with another Democrat. The idea that the Princeton voters or the voters of Central New Jersey would rise up and elect a Republican under any circumstances, no matter what our member of Congress did, are extremely low. So, as far as I know, Congresswoman Watson Coleman has not done anything wrong, but if she were, she could essentially unconstrained, because very little chance that she would ever, lose her office. It's very different than what it was 20 years ago in Princeton, where this district basically had 2 tied congressional elections in a row, and so you're really forced to pay a lot of attention to the district when an election could be won by a Republican or a Democrat. It's very different. It's a very different situation now, and polarization makes it very, very hard to hold members accountable. It's kind of like the Donald Trump line about shooting someone on Fifth Avenue. Many members of Congress could shoot someone on the main street of their hometown and still be reelected, because the alternative is to replace them with somebody in the other party, and voters are not willing to do that.
So you talk about incentives primarily in terms of getting reelected here. So you're talking about either the primary system or the general election in a district or state as being the primary incentive driver for every individual member. And also you're throwing in there the national organizations that could fund their campaigns. And so it still kind of traces back to this same reelection incentive. What other incentives are there in there? I mean, like you said, maybe they don't care about the committees anymore because there's no power there. Are there any other incentives that play out in your mind in Congress that would alter their behavior to vote or to do any particular thing?
Well, I mean, that's a good point. So they have, incentives come from lots of places. So traditionally, we think of congressional incentives as being focused around, reelection, sort of advancement in the institution, so moving from, regular rank and file member into kind of a leadership role, either in the committee or a party, or progressive ambition to say move from the House to the Senate or, to some other role. And then, some contribution to good public policy. So let me start from the last one, good public policy. There's no doubt that there are lots of members of Congress who are genuinely motivated, to make good public policy, and they dedicate a lot of their time to doing that. But I think there's an institutional problem in that there are probably not enough of them, to be effective. For all the reasons we've talked about, to be successful, you have to build large coalitions. You have to get people on the other side to work with you to make that happen. My general sense is that the number of people who are acting in terms of wanting to make, according to their conception, good public policy is high, but it's not high enough. So leaving the other two, wanting to advance outside of Congress to something else, or advance within Congress through the parties. I mean, I think there may be levers there to kind of change incentives, but it would take, again, pushing against the wind in lots of cases. So take a party advancement. I do think the parties would like to reward through leadership, promotion opportunities, those people who would like to make good public policy and put them in positions of authority. And if they were, to the extent to which they were able to do that, that would strengthen the incentives to be good policymakers. But a lot of the kind of broader polarized incentives come into play there. So parties themselves have to raise a lot of money. So there's a lot of evidence that the people who are getting promoted into leadership positions are those people who are best at fundraising, not the ones that are the best at making good public policy. At any given time, there's going to be a lot of pressure on, the Republican Party to promote members of the Freedom Caucus into positions of leadership, or to demand a share of leadership positions purely on those grounds, or from, the progressives in the Democratic Party to demand leadership positions for their members. And so, again, it undermines the ability of parties to set up incentive structures, to reward people who are dedicated policymakers. So I think I'm not so pessimistic that parties can't consciously try to do a better job against these headwinds, but those are the headwinds. And then for people who want to get promoted to the Senate, again, in an environment where policy accomplishments seem less important than the kind of ability to raise money and be visible, it's hard to use that lever, to get incentives. There, I think the change will have to come externally. I mean, I think, culturally, through journalism, whatever, we need to really focus on those people who are good legislators, make it worthwhile, for their advancement beyond the House to have been a good legislator. So you mentioned your projects and kind of measuring, legislative effectiveness, performance, and stuff. The extent to which those can become markers for legislative success and incentivize people to say use them. I don't know if you're gonna have a scoring system or what, but say, my Sunwater score is 97, that's why you should elect me to the Senate, rather than I'm being a little cynical here, but rather than say, I'm good on Twitter, you should elect me to the Senate. I think if you can have that kind of cultural change where, for these two other things that members care about, internal advancement in the party, external advancement in politics, to make policy making kind of central to those, I think would be the main levers for changing the behavioral incentives.
Yeah, Volden and Weissman have their legislative effectiveness score, and we talked to them as well. And you're right. Without the feedback loops to the electorate, I mean, that's obviously the best way. If there's some kind of feedback loop to the electorate that links performance to in their minds to legislation and oversight, without that feedback loop, you're pushing it. You're running against the wind.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I will get the anecdote. I will get the anecdote wrong, but John F. Kennedy, won the Pulitzer for his profiles and courage, and I think a very large number of the people he profiled lost their re-elections, and not to diminish their courage, but it's you got to stay in office in order. And you got to rise in authority within office to have the good effects. And so even for the ones with the best intentions, winning elections is going to continue to be first and foremost. And we just need to make sure that those people who are good legislators are better able to win elections. The extent that they can demonstrate that, I think many of the other problems will take care of themselves.
And Burke lost his own election as well, as we know, which is a perfect segue, in fact, into my questions that I ask all of our guests, so that I can compare the answers. The first one we've already talked about at length, but I'll maybe try to squeeze you a little bit more on it, which is, what do you think congressional representation should mean?
Yeah. I go back to the answer, I think that they should be trustees in the sense of, being able to, develop expertise on public policy, try to match that expertise to the real needs of their districts and constituents, and occasionally make very tough decisions, not for anyone other than their districts. I think representation is very important. But it can't be this pure delegatory representation, because then hard choices can't be made, and then there's no incentive for members to develop expertise, but simply just to poll their constituents. And I big fan of democracy, but the representational function is extremely important, in making it work.
So you believe in judgments to be made by representatives, that they're judging, they're not reflecting exactly the beliefs of their constituents.
Yeah,
what about
districts?
And what about the constituents themselves? Do they represent the majority? Do they represent everyone equally in their district or state?
The constituent, well, I mean, there are big issues of kind of what we'll call just political inequality, and that some voices get magnified much more than others. And 50 years of political science was uncovered what those biases are, and they're usually centered around socioeconomic statuses such as income, education, and so forth. And I do think representatives should, make a special effort to undo those biases by, reaching out to less advantaged citizens, just to, get a better sense of what their real problems are, because the people who are on Twitter and the people who find their way to their offices, the people who write them letters are, as we know, are not a representative sample. And so part of the legislator's job is to actually, try to unbias that sample, find out, what are the things that would make the most lives of the most people in their districts, better. And, I think that's another important, failure of representation, is that, if anything, these biases in voice, it seems to have been exacerbated over the past couple of decades.
So that's interesting. So you think that there's going to be a natural bias towards some voices being louder than others, and part of the representative job is to find out what the quieter folks are thinking and normalize that representation across the whole population. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent way to put it. I mean, there's some really good research now by David Brookman at Berkeley and others, who basically find that even Democratic representatives believe that their constituencies are much more conservative than they actually are, which stems, precisely from these biases of who they have contact with. And then, the other thing that's, obvious but worth noting is that, for the most part, members of Congress are have higher incomes than average, or wealthier than average, or clearly more educated than average, and therefore just naturally, as part of their lives as social beings, have networks of people that are more like them and less like the other people that they represent. So it's not that they're doing anything pernicious. It's just they have to realize that fact and make an extra effort to make sure that people they talk to aren't nearly as biased a sample as that the people they would talk to just as part of their normal social lives.
And how about the future generations? So we're talking about constituency as generally being alive and voting potentially. What about next generation, 2 or 3 generations, 10 generations down? Does the representative also represent them, or is the representative tied to the current people in his district, his or her district?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Not one I put a lot of thought into. My basic reaction is that in a legal sense, and when we sort of draw these analogies to trustees and how those arrangements are worked out, in a legal sense, the answer is no. But the representative should be cognizant of the fact that his constituents probably do, and if they don't, should care about future generations, and should try to reflect the kind of weight of their constituencies' thought on how to prepare for the future, whether it's on climate change or investments in education or whatever. I think the representative clearly has an obligation to reflect his constituency's view on these kind of intertemporal preferences. My guess, again, to be a little more realistic, pragmatic, is that and we see this in lots of policy areas, is that representatives who weight those issues, intergenerational issues, much more than their constituents who currently tolerate don't stay in office very long. So in part, I think it's kind of, I think they should take them into consideration. I think the media and culture should encourage citizens to think in terms of broader view, and that should feed back.
Right, but I'm asking your
sure
personal
it may be too much to ask for legislators to start maximizing the incomes of the 3 generations from now at the expense of the current generation. They won't stay in office very long unless the current generation comes around to
but they can borrow from them, it sounds like.
They can't borrow from them. That's all debt funded.
All right, so great. Well, next question is, how would your ideal Congress allocate its time? And by that, I mean DC versus the home district, legislation, oversight, campaigning.
Yeah, I won't have exact numbers. The thing I guess I would just stress is that it seems like, based on the data I've seen, that they currently over allocate, to fundraising in campaigning. So we should take a reduction. We should take a reduction out of that. There's a lot of criticism of Congress for spending too much time at home, based on what I just said about members needing to unbias their information samples. I think that criticism of them is sort of misguided. I think they do need to spend time at home. They do need to find ways to talk to constituents and do it in a way that's, and sometimes deliberately kind of, again, unbiasing their samples. Just holding a town hall occasionally, that's not going to unbias your sample, because we know who's going to go on there. So they need to think more cleverly about that, and that involves being at home. I think in general they need to spend more time. The typical member needs to spend more time on legislation. but I don't blame them for not spending more time on that. As we've talked about, the kind of centralization of authority in Congress has given them relatively little to do. And so I think it's an institutional problem that members are not spending enough time, not spending enough time on legislation and committees. And then, I obviously think oversight is important. Sometimes Congress spends too much time on oversight for partisan reasons, and sometimes not enough, again, for partisan reasons. So my view on oversight really is not about the amount of time they spend doing it, but the incentives to do it, for the right reasons. And so yeah, I think the big misallocation is on, and this is not controversial at all, but is on fundraising campaign side. I don't see a problem with them spending a fair amount of time in their districts. I think they should. I think they should spend more time legislating, but that's really not their fault in many cases.
All right, next question is, how should debate, deliberation, or dialogue occur or be structured in Congress?
Yeah, I think, I mentioned the importance of, some degree of kind of secrecy or less than 100% transparency. I think that's important. I will concede that, a big part of the legitimating function of Congress is the fact that, the citizens can see a little bit about how the sausage is being made. I understand the trade-offs. So I would like to see, if I could just, tell them to do things exactly as I would do them, I would have them have the spaces for, more private negotiation, elaboration, but in the end, provide this educational function of actually debating, the bills on the merits, on the floor, in a kind of a civil and kind of a grown-up way. I mean, the kind of some of the stunts you see on the floor, with props and things like that were clearly designed simply to, get picked up by cable news or social media, or just outrageous. I'd like to, the extent to which leaders can do this, I'd like to see a lot less of that. And, and actually have really, serious discussions about the pros and cons.
And so that would be on the floor, or that would be in committee?
I'd like to see more on the floor, because that's where people are gonna, not that people are gonna watch it necessarily, but that's more likely to get covered. I'd like to see more of that in committee. I'd like to see more of that in committee too. I think there's an educational function, of again, explaining why these hard trade-offs that Congress has to make. Now, again, the problem is the one I identified when I talked about my model, which is like the incentives to actually be sincere in these debates are often missing. And so, the problem is, even if you got rid of the props and stunts, the incentive for members to, state truthfully the pros and cons rather than exaggerate them, just aren't there in the current environment. And so again, this change that we need to kind of elevate the policymakers rather than the influencers, is really important.
All right, next question is, what fundamental institutional improvement should Congress make within 50 years?
That's actually a hard one to answer. Because part of my, research is showing really how hard it is to make reforms and to make them stick. So I'm going to answer it slightly differently, in that I'm going to talk about two popular reforms that I'm going to say Congress shouldn't do, because it would make things worse. There are a lot of reforms I've written about which are I don't really care whether you do them or not, but they're not going to fix polarization. So with things like gerrymandering, fixing primary systems, etc., you know, I think that's just misguided reform effort in many cases, uh, that they won't make things worse. There's a couple of things that I think current ideas that are very popular, which I think would actively make things worse. That you may have heard, and people may be vouching for in the podcast. One, and I've sort of alluded to this before. I think one of the big problems in Congress right now is, again, they spend too much time fundraising in the literal sense of like dialing for dollars, calling donors. But I think they spend way too much time focused on the kind of building the media profiles that they need to raise money through these networks and not networks of small donors. So they spend a lot of time coming up with the tough tweet, or they try to get on this cable news show or that cable news show in order to build their profile, kind of an extreme profile which would appeal to small donors. A lot of evidence. The evidence is really mounting that small donors, people who contribute to the internet in particular, have very extreme policy views, and the way that you raise money from them is being as extreme. There's sort of active efforts to kind of incentivize small donations through matching funds and public financing schemes, which are predicated on getting a certain amount of small donors. So things I'd like to see Congress do over 50 years is to not do that, at least on the current media environment. I think that would make many of the problems in Congress somewhat worse. Another reform that people focus a lot on, I think sometimes for the wrong reasons, is to expand the size of the House of Representatives. And, in the notion that it started out as one member for every 35,000 people, and is now one member for like around 850, 900,000 people, as if that ratio matters a whole lot. I actually think under the current configuration of Congress, where things are very centralized and most members don't have a whole lot of legislative things to do, having more people in the House not doing anything other than tweeting and Instagramming and going on cable news would make things far worse. It's not clear to me that there's a kind of a good legislation rationale or an improvement in representation in the broader sense in which I mean it, that having a larger House of Representatives solved. So the backward way of answering your question, here's two things that are very, very popular in certain circles that I'm not particularly enthusiastic about, but I think the knockoff effects might be pretty bad.
All right, next question is, what book or article most shaped your thinking with respect to congressional reform?
So you mentioned that you've had her on before, and so I will plug a book. But my colleague Frances Lee, I think both of her books, Beyond Ideology and Unstable Majorities, are really important for the discussions of both reform and polarization. Not that I think that, again, the first one, Beyond Ideology, really points to some of the issues that I alluded to about transparency. She basically finds that, one of her big findings is that the participation of the president in the policy debate tends to structure things around partisan divisions in ways which are kind of, counterproductive in terms of congressional policymaking. And so it's a nice argument for keeping, if you really want to get something done, have the president leave it to Congress to get it done. And I think there are lots of areas where presidents need to be involved, but sometimes presidents are over involved. Congress needs to have the fortitude to kind of go its own way. If it can keep issues from becoming partisan, it'll go a long way to solving that. And in the second book, it really highlights the the importance of electoral competition among the parties for polarization. The idea that, you know, things are evenly balanced, and so, you know, every policy issue is really an opportunity for, you know, electoral gamesmanship in ways that kind of undermine the process. And so it suggests, and it notes several knockoff findings about, you know, the rise of messaging legislation, the fact that Congress overinvests in communication staff relative to policy staff, and so it identifies a few areas in which, you know, one could think about you know, reform, or just, you know, taking resources away from purely, you know, partisan activities of members and redirecting them back into the policymaking apparatus. So I think they're, you know, they have great ideas. I mean, you know, she's across the hall from me. We debate these things a lot. You know, neither of us think that either of us is right about everything, but, you know, I think those are two good books that really kind of stimulate a lot of thinking about, you know, the kind of core problems that Congress faces, and, you know, suggest some modest things that we might do about them.
All right, last question is just about your long-term plans in terms of your research and the direction you're moving.
Yeah, so the book I'm working on now really is focused on how polarization has changed the kind of operation of our constitutional system. In particular, you know, how it's shaped the separation of powers, how it's impacted the courts in their role in society. I think one of the more interesting parts is the federalism part, which you know, highlights the extent to which, you know, both polarization between the parties has manifested itself into conflict both between states and the federal government. So California versus Donald Trump, Texas versus Joe Biden, but also kind of conflicts across states, you know, when it comes to policy areas and cooperation, and you know, and so federalism been fundamentally transformed by polarization, because the role of the states as actors and national politics is really increased, and then the kind of the ability of the national government to constrain the states through making policies at the national level is impeded. And so, you know, the argument's really about how state politics would become, you know, much more central, you know, over the coming years, for good, and in some cases, and for not so good in others.
Professor McCarty, thank you so much for spending time with us. It's been a pleasure.
Great, thank you.